Hero of the Soviet Union Yuri Gagarin was returning from a training flight in his MiG-15 UTI. In the back seat was his instructor for the day, hero of the Soviet Union Vladimir Seryagin. The weather was worse than expected, but the mission had been a simple one, just refamiliarization with this type. Suddenly, two large bangs resounded through the cockpit. The MiG flipped on its back and began to spin, its engine stalled. As Gagarin struggled to control his falling aircraft, he saw two big engines receding, their afterburner plumes glowing like demonic eyes through the overcast. Some aircraft, the F-86 Sabre, the F-15 Eagle, are renowned as true greats, noble knights of the sky. Some, like the MiG-15, the MiG-17, or the Hawker Hunter, are regarded as plucky underdogs, solid, hard workers. Some fighters are just well known for being rubbish, like the Attacker, the Fury, and the MiG-27. But the SU-15 Flagon occupies a unique historical position. It's the aircraft you want if you're going to commit an atrocity. You see, the Su-15 is the character who sits quietly in the corner of the restaurant in the Mafia movie. Gianluigi, the mafiosi with the glasses, who looks like an accountant. He drives a Volvo sedan. Gianluigi isn't the muscle. He's not one of the obvious dudes with bulging biceps and six-shooters that lounge around the bar. MiG-25, I see you. No, Gianluigi is the one that Big Tony turns to when he needs a real psycho to go into a rival's house and murder their family, just to make a point, capiche? That's the Flagon, the psycho killer of Cold War aviation, and hero of the Soviet Union Yuri Gagarin was just the appetizer in a 30-year killing spree. In some ways, it's not surprising that the Flagon turned out this way. It was the child of troubled parents. Pavel Sukhoi had been a somewhat successful designer and had his OKB until he had a falling out with Stalin and lost everything bar his life. Fortunately for Sukhoi, a couple of years after that trauma, Stalin died and his OKB was reinstated in 1953. His first projects were what became the Su-7 Fitter and the Su-9 Fishpot, which entered service in 1960. The Su-9 in particular gave the PVO a great deal of trouble. They just kept crashing. 20 in the first 18 months of operation. Sukhoi could be somewhat forgiven for being irritated that it was his design that came under fire, as the gross unreliability of Lulka's AL-7F engine caused at least half of the losses. Based on this, the PVO decided that they no longer wanted single-engined interceptors, as twin-engined fighters obviously gave a greater safety margin. Their preferences were for the large Yak-28P and the giant Tupolev Tu-128 Fiddler. Just to make matters more irritating for Sukhoi, MiG had brought the PVO a radar-equipped version of their reliable Tumansky-engined MiG-21 known as the PF. This looked promising and the PVO was keen. On the 27th of November 1961, the Politburo issued a directive ordering the Su-9 line to be stopped and the purchase of the more advanced follow-on Su-11 to be drastically cut back. As was often the case in this period, Yakovlev was the main beneficiary, with production of the Yak-28 being increased to compensate. Sukhoi's OKB was once again facing closure. It was surplus to requirements. Manned combat aircraft in general were a little unpopular in the Soviet Union at this time. Like many other governments, they believed that guided missiles had rendered manned aircraft obsolete. In response, their initial idea, started in 1960, was to create an advanced version of the Su-11 called the T-58. This carried an upgraded version of the Su-11's Oriole radar, creatively known as Oriole-2. Because it was so large, it wouldn't fit inside the Su-11's shock cone, and therefore a new nose had to be developed and the air intakes moved to the fuselage sides, which were area-ruled at this stage. Armament was two new K-40 missiles. Unfortunately, Bisnavat's OKB-4 failed to produce a working missile, and the T-58 project was terminated in the summer of 1961. Fortunately, just as the twin-engined Mafia began their campaign in 1960, Sukhoi had started work on an alternative interceptor that used two R-21F300 engines in place of the big Loika. It was designated T-58D. R-21 turned out to have insurmountable design issues, so Sukhoi turned to a variant of the same R-11 that was in the MiG-21. So important had the project become that Sukhoi himself led the design effort. Alongside the engine change was a weapons change. MiG were at this time deep into the development of the YE-155P heavy interceptor, which would eventually become the MiG-25. That aircraft was armed with the K-40 Acrid. In discussions with the Defense Ministry, Sukhoi agreed to shift the T-58D to carry the K-8M2 ANAB in semi-active radar homing and infrared forms. These would be replaced by the upgraded K-98 ANAB before weapons trials began. The Oriol radar was further developed to produce the Sokol, which would later be redesignated back to Oriol. Because why not? This version of the radar had a detection range of 18 miles against a bomber and a tracking range of about 10. It swept a volume 60 degrees to either side of the nose and 30 degrees above it, 15 degrees below. In the early 1960s, the Strategic Air Command had deployed 2 wings of supersonic B-58 Hustlers, and they were developing the B-70 Valkyrie. PVO's intended employment of their next-generation interceptors therefore required the aircraft to be rapidly flown to a position as far out from strategic targets as possible under GCI control. Because of the very high speed and altitude of the incoming bombers, no interceptor was expected to be able to reach an equal or greater altitude before reaching their firing position. There would be no opportunity for a second shot from the rear either, so as he closed in, the pilot would acquire the target on his own radar. When he reached the firing position indicated by the fire control computer, he would execute a sharp pull-up and fire his missiles in a zoom climb. The high supersonic K-8 missile would do the rest. Such was the closure speed of the interceptor and the target, potentially as high as 5 times the speed of sound, automation was critical in order for an engagement to be successfully prosecuted. Closure speed would be in the region of a mile a second, making orchestration of the interception beyond the capability of the average human to react. As in the 1950s US interceptors, T-58D was therefore equipped with an automatic flight control system, designated SAU-58. It automatically calculated bearings for the pilot to follow and contained pre-programmed climb profiles to execute the snap-up attack. It was also able to take steering directions from GCI, so the pilot could either fly the plane using dead reckoning, take guidance cues from the autopilot, or let the computer fly the intercept. Don't think about this like Sage, though. It was more like a remote control for an individual GCI controller to use than an automated battle management system. All of this avionics kit and the additional engine meant that T-58 was significantly heavier than its predecessor, albeit also more powerful. Since the wings were the same, wing loading was higher, and thus takeoff and landing runs were longer. Somewhat mitigating this, the designers had introduced blown flaps, facilitated by air bled from the engine compressors. Heavier duty landing gear was also needed. Sadly, higher wing loading also meant even lower maneuverability. But since the PVO's intention was for the T-58 to engage single, very fast-flying targets flying in straight lines, speed and high-altitude performance were Sukhoi's primary goals. They thus did nothing more to the wing design, a mistake that they would need to rectify later. A prototype of this highly developed Su-11 was ready in the first few months of 1962 and made its maiden flight on the 30th of May. It performed impeccably in 56 test flights, demonstrating the fundamental rightness of the shift to twin engines. GCAT were now happy with the airframe and performance, but wanted the new Sukhoi interceptor to deploy with the same Smerch AS or Tornado radar as in the MiG-25 and the Tu-128. Unfortunately, the change of radar would mean wholesale alterations to the forward fuselage, and since no prototype radars were available, the program would have been set back by many months or even years. Sukhoi therefore lobbied, successfully as it happened, for GCAT and the Politburo to accept the Oriol radar in the first version of the new interceptor, with a Smerch version following when the systems were widely available and airframe modifications had been made. In making this compromise, the military had to accept a maximum target speed of 2,000 kilometers per hour, 1,240 miles per hour in old money, and 75,000 feet of altitude. 2 more prototypes were constructed, incorporating detailed changes such as a more pointed, drag-reducing radome and a 15-inch height boost to the vertical fin to increase stability. The braking parachute was contained in the plug that was inserted for this purpose. Aileron authority was unimpressive at low speed, a result of the small wings. The engines also ran roughly during maneuvers as they were partially blanked by the forward fuselage as the aircraft turned and sideslipped. Test pilots also lamented the loss of accelerative urge versus the Su-11. T-58 had gained 3,300 pounds over that aircraft, 22,180 pounds versus 18,870. Finally fitted with the delayed SU-58 system, weapons trials began in August 1963 and lasted until June 1964. Remarkably, these went just as smoothly as the airframe trials. 87 trial interceptions were made, directed by the Air 1 GCI system. Performance was exactly as had been promised by the manufacturer's estimates. Live K-98 missiles were supplied in early 1964 and test firings began. As with other tests, the results were as expected, with the exception of performance in high supersonic head-on engagements. In this mode, the closure speed proved too fast for the proximity fuse to handle, leading to the targets escaping the blast radius. Overall, the state acceptance trials had gone really well. The T-58D was significantly superior to the previous Su-11. The new radar detected targets further away and could hold onto them longer, especially in the face of jamming. The aircraft was more stable in flight, generally easier to handle, and it offered twin-engine safety. Almost as good, strategically speaking, was the fact that although the T-58D was essentially a new aircraft, it had sufficient commonality with the Su-9 and 11 that its mass production didn't require extensive factory retooling. It also shared numerous systems with the Su-11 and the Ac-28P. The only substantive issue was lack of range. The specification had demanded 1,300 miles of ferry range, but the T-58D could only manage a paltry 780. Sukhoi remedied this by filling in the area rule portion of the fuselage with fuel tanks, increasing fuel capacity to 1,509 gallons and providing the required range. In-flight refueling was not possible, although many experiments were conducted in the 1970s on a probe and drogue setup. State trials had been completed in June 1964. Typically, though, Yakovlev started whining and trying to derail things for his own benefit. Although he was ultimately unsuccessful, he did delay procurement of the type for nearly a year. Full-scale production was thus finally authorized on the 30th of April 1965, although some thought was given to designating it as a modified Su-11. The Council of Ministers eventually decided that it was a new plane and it would be known as the Su-15 Aerial Intercept Weapon System. Novosibirsk Factory No. 153 was instructed to prepare to mass-produce them starting in early 1966. The first example took some time to get out, only emerging in February 66 and taking its first flight on the 6th of March. By the end of 1966, though, production had started to gain some momentum. The resultant Su-15 was a rugged but stately, even a beautiful aircraft. Its long 67-foot 4-inch fuselage was a traditional semi-monocoque made mainly of aluminium with some stainless steel in areas subjected to high engine temperatures or aerodynamic heating. The exception was the radome, which was made of glass-reinforced plastic. Going front to back, the radar and the computers occupied most of the forward frames of the fuselage. They were accessed by unbolting large access panels on the sides of the fuselage. A pressure bulkhead separated the avionics bay from the cockpit, which features a bubble canopy offering decent all-round visibility, albeit blocked by some frames. This arrangement is quite unusual for a Soviet fighter, and it was required because of the need for operation in poor weather. The view over the long nose was unfortunately quite poor despite the elevated position, and the optically flat bulletproof glass windscreen that had been fitted. Visibility aft was also less good because of the metal portion at the lower rear of the canopy glass. Access to the cockpit was through the sliding, blown perspex center portion of the canopy. This featured heating elements to demist it. Air bled from the engines was also used to clear rain and to demist. The pilot sat on a Sukhoi-designed KS-4 ejection seat that could be used above 87 miles per hour, but apparently at all altitudes and speeds right up to Vmax. Continuing aft, the engine intakes begin directly below the pilot's seat. They are sharply angled and they feature boundary layer splitter plates. These disguise the fact that the fuselage is actually area ruled in the forward area, exhibiting the classic inward Coke bottle curve. You'll also notice the large patches of anti-glare coating on the tops of the intakes and ahead of the cockpit. These were needed because, perhaps obviously, the SU-15 was usually deployed in natural metal and was therefore quite reflective. Each intake feeds one engine, and they have an internal three-piece intake ramp to control the speed of air hitting the turbine blades at different speeds and angles of attack. There is also an auxiliary blow-in door in the intake side. The movable structures are controlled by the same UVD-58M computer that also controls the engines, to reduce pilot workload and theoretically at least maximize engine performance. The air data boom supplying information to that computer to act on was in the tip of the nose radome. Immediately behind the cockpit, there's a second avionics bay containing, amongst other things, the autopilot and fire control computer. Aside from the radar, the Su-15 had a full complement of systems. Amongst other things, there was an instrument landing system, which is obviously essential in an all-weather aircraft. There's a data link for the Lazar-M ground control system, IFF interrogation systems, and a Sirena 2 radar warning receiver. Although more advanced than something like a MiG-21, the Su-15 was not at the level of the MiG-25, which had the best of everything. The three main fuel cells are also in that center section of the fuselage, and there were two weapons pylons beneath the intake ducts. These are plumbed for two 600-litre drop tanks. Total fuel capacity, including the one tank in each wing, was 8,800 litres. Engine accessories and the oil tanks for each engine are in the lower portion of the center section. External power was plugged in via two sockets in the lower portside center fuselage. The short delta wings are attached to the fuselage slightly aft of center and set at a 2-degree anhedral. The wingspan was only 28 feet 3 inches, yet there was space for two hardpoints on each wing. There are blown flaps on the inboard portion of the wing and ailerons outboard of them. As you'd expect, most of the rear was occupied by two Tumansky R13D300 turbojets. These were the advanced version of the MiG-21's R11D, and also featured in the improved MiG-21M. The Su-15 without suffix, which eventually became the majority of the Su-15 run, actually had the R11 F2S300 from the MiG-21, which gave about 10% less power than the R13D. The engine bay was separated from the center fuselage and also longitudinally by a titanium firewall to protect the aluminium structure. Each R13 engine gave 9,040 pounds of thrust dry and 14,550 pounds in afterburner. It was a relatively conservative two-spool design with just a 3-stage low-pressure compressor and a 5-stage high-pressure compressor. The afterburner was controllable so that it was not just on or off, which is a plus, but the R13's real strong point was its lightweight and its small size. It weighed just 2,500 pounds dry, it was 15 feet long and 2 feet 11 inches in diameter. Although slightly less powerful than the contemporary US J-79, it weighed 1,300 pounds less, it was 2.5 feet shorter and about 6 inches slimmer in diameter. The downside of the R11 and the R13 was relatively slow response to throttle inputs, which was more of an issue for aircraft like the MiG-21 that was likely to find itself in dogfights than the Su-15, which was not. Each engine had a 12 kilowatt generator attached to it, which powered up the 28 volt DC electrical system, and it had a generator for single phase AC. Two silver zinc batteries provided backup in the event of a double engine failure with no turbine rotation. Essentially, there was plenty of power for electronics, which is useful given the copious current draw of the radar, and there was sufficient redundancy against damage. Interestingly, there was only limited redundancy in the hydraulic system, presumably because the Su-15 was not expected to take battle damage. There were two hydraulic systems, but one of them was focused on the landing gear, flaps in the portside engine intake ramp and nozzle, while the other one did the same for the starboard side plus the radar dish drive. The only backup hydraulic system was for the control surfaces, for which there was a primary system and a backup, with a standalone pump to pressurize the system in the event of a dual engine failure. The wheel brakes were pneumatic, and the same system also facilitated emergency blowdown of the landing gear and flaps. Finally, there was another standalone pneumatic system to spin up the ANAV missile gyros via air supplied to the pylons. There are 4 large air brakes around the rear fuselage with the conventional 55-degree swept horizontal tail and tall single vertical tail right aft. Horizontal tail surfaces moved differentially on stub axles. As I mentioned earlier, the braking parachute is at the base of the fin. Neither the centre or the rear fuselage is area ruled because of the need to fit in that extra fuel. Overall, it was an impressive aircraft. Empty weight was 22,500 pounds, rising to 36,420 in a normal takeoff configuration. Thrust to weight ratio from the pair of engines was an impressive 0.92 when in full afterburner. Maximum speed at altitude was Mach 1.8 at 50,000 feet when carrying weapons. Service ceiling was over 60,000 feet. Typical armament for all missions was a pair of R-98s, usually one radar guided and one IR. There were downsides to the design in this incarnation. Range with drop tanks was a paltry 960 miles. Landing speed was very high at 195 miles per hour, although with the braking parachute the landing run was only 3,300 feet. But more problems were to come. Although production was by this time well established, it wasn't until July 1967 that the first units began to receive their SU-15s. They were initially somewhat disappointed. There were 3 major issues with the aircraft as delivered. First, the R-11 engines not only had a propensity to catch fire, causing the loss of half a dozen aircraft in the first year, but those engines manufactured at one of the 2 factories didn't deliver the design power. It turned out that although Factory 500 in Moscow could make the engines properly, Factory 26 at Ufa could not. In June 1969, presumably after a round of 7.62mm caliber HR and quality improvements, the Ufa factory did manage to produce engines that met the design specification, although overall performance was disappointing to the PVO. Fire suppression systems remained ineffective throughout the aircraft's service life, compounding the issues. The second issue related to aircraft handling. The promised addition of dampers to the hydraulic flight control system had not materialized, which would have been more of an issue had the Su-15 not been quite a heavy aircraft with small control surfaces. As a result, stability never raised its head as an issue during the type's operations. Unfortunately, the downside of those small control surfaces was that in some flight modes, stick forces would suddenly increase to very unacceptable levels. More powerful actuation and some aerodynamic changes were investigated, but ultimately not implemented on the original Su-15. The final issue was that the blown flaps had yet to be fitted to the early aircraft, leading to excessively long takeoff and landing runs. This problem would ultimately result in a wing redesign being accepted. Sukhoi had started thinking about that problem while the arguments about whether to order the Su-15 at all were ongoing. Their solution was to modify the delta wing so that the leading edge sweep of the outer portions was reduced from 60 degrees to 45. Span also increased by 72 centimeters and the ailerons had more powerful hydraulic boost. Both types of these wings, the original delta and the double delta, were quite weak in comparison to contemporary types though. Although the wings had a 6.5 degree structural limit, there was little or no margin for error. During practice for the type's initial appearance in 1967, one of the display team executed an overly aggressive pull-up, causing the pylon and the attached missile to separate and fly off one wing. When the aircraft landed, it transpired that having been over-G'd, the aircraft structure was badly twisted and it was subsequently written off. The first prototype modified with the double delta wing flew in February 1965 and demonstrated superior aileron authority at low speeds. In exchange, 1,300 feet was knocked off the service ceiling, which the PVO reluctantly accepted. Although it was a big improvement, that wing was not immediately implemented because the jigs and tooling for the original wing had already been made, and the factory at Novosibirsk didn't want to make new ones without getting full use out of the originals. Later in the manufacturing run, the crank delta wings would become standard, shortly before R-13s replaced the R-11s. Avionics were the last area of difficulty. Because of delays to the Oriole M radar, the first batch of aircraft had an even less capable version of the same unit that was rather susceptible to ECM. Eventually, the electronics OKBs came through and the Oriole M was retrofitted to aircraft already deployed and fitted to others out of the factory. The situation with the other weapon systems avionics was even worse. An operational version of the Su-58 proved very challenging to develop and it wouldn't be ready for trials until 1968. Early aircraft therefore had no automatic fire control or even a basic autopilot. In essence, the Su-15 was a disappointment as delivered. Its weapon system represented only a minor upgrade over the Su-11, and the twin-engine configuration didn't deliver much in the way of additional reliability because of the R-11's quality problems and the control force and field performance issues. As early as the spring of 1965, the military had become worried that the Su-15 didn't offer enough speed or enough avionics sophistication to make use of the good aspects of the design. They therefore issued a requirement, and remember that requirements in the Soviet Union were more like orders, for a Su-15 Stage 2. Ironically, the Sukhoi OKB was now overloaded with work, and it didn't really want to do the upgrade. They eventually got round to it in 1966. Sukhoi started the process by figuring out how to fit a Caution 58 radar, actually fit the Su-58, and various other electronic bits. I can't find out a great deal about the Caution other than it was intended as an upgrade path for the MiG-17 and MiG-19 as well as the Su-15. Anyway, it failed to hit its performance parameters and it was deselected unofficially in October 1967 and officially in March 1968. The alternative was a variant of the large and powerful Smerch radar from the MiG-25. In this smaller, downgraded form, it was known as the Typhoon, hence the designation of the first upgraded version of the Su-15 as the Su-15T. Typhoon had a detection range of about 45 miles against bombers and 35 against fighters. It could track a bomber at 35 and a fighter at 25. It scanned a volume 140 degrees across in the horizontal arc and 40 degrees in the vertical. Although the intention was to upgrade to the R-13D engine, the Su-15T actually went into production with the R-11. It had the double delta wings and the updated control servos that were compatible with the Su-58. Su-58 was a fascinating system that not only automated intercept navigation, but also contained a low-level flight mode which enabled the Su-15 to fly below a low-level attacker in order to use its radar to get a lock. The Oyol, after all, had no look-down, shoot-down capabilities. It wasn't a proper terrain-following system like you'd find on an F-111. It just flew the aircraft straight and level at a preset height above the ground, as given by the radar altimeter, so that the pilot was free to concentrate on the radar. Only usable over flat ground, I'd suggest. Other major avionics changes included replacing the Sirena 2 radar warning receiver with a more sensitive Sirena 3. Also interesting at this stage was the military's requirement that the Su-15 could be used in a ground attack role. Its hardpoints were therefore modified so that it could carry 500 kilogram, which is a decidedly unmetric 1,102 pound bombs. 16-shot 57mm rocket pods could also be carried, or heavy unguided rockets. Two UPK-23 250 23mm gun pods, each with 250 rounds, could also be carried under the fuselage. These were regularly used in the early 1970s onwards as a response to issues that the Su-15 was having in intercepting low and slow-flying light aircraft intruding on the Soviet Union's borders. Sukhoi kept pushing for a more permanent cannon installation. In 1968 and 69, they had attempted to cram in an experimental 23mm Gatling cannon into the starboard wing root, but they couldn't figure out how to fit the magazine into the thin wing structure. Their next attempt was to add a GP9 pod on an additional centerline attachment point. GP9 was a twin-barrel 23mm weapon with 200 rounds. 10 production aircraft even had these mounting points, and the squadron that received the aircraft seemingly also had some pods. I bet they were a fun distraction from the monotony of GCI intercepts. Just look at all those smiling faces. Sukhoi kept pushing for an internal 23mm cannon, and they modified one aircraft with such a fitment, in the fuselage centerline just aft of the nose wheel. Unfortunately, the lack of an effective gun sight meant that accuracy with this and the podded weapons was poor, and so the system was never adopted. Incidentally, this was roughly the same stage that the USADC realised the backup to the finicky air-to-air missiles it had might be useful. Up until the time that the F-106 started to carry an M61 Vulcan, the contingency plan was to spear a backfire's canopy with the Delta Dart's wing. The Flagon's backup plan was to ram the bomber if it could catch it, and then for the pilot to eject if he was still alive. After the Su-15T came the Su-15TM, which had improved radios and an Iskra-K Shoran system that could get the pilot within 165 feet of the ground in all conditions. Although it sounds like a small thing, it actually made a big difference to pilot survivability in difficult landing conditions. After the extended wait for a functioning radar and automatic fire control equipment, prototype aircraft began their trials in 1969, and those trials were a total disaster. The Su-15 had been a perfect student, completing 100% of its test missions successfully. The Su-15T was a dunce. 24 of the intended 87 Stage A trial missions were aborted because of equipment failures, and that rate would have been a lot worse as the trials were paused for a time after the 24 of the first 64 missions had been aborted. Stage B missions that focused on operational employment of weapons also demonstrated that the Typhoon radar was less than perfect from a reliability and a usability perspective. Even so, the trials were declared a great success and production of the Su-15T was authorized. But with the updated TM version now in testing, the military was basically uninterested in the T. Only 20 were completed, and they only began to be transferred to the Operational Trials Squadron in early 1971. That's probably just as well, because the Su-15T was also a disappointment. Interception trials against low-flying aircraft showed that the Typhoon couldn't actually reliably detect targets, let alone lock onto them. In 5 test flights, targets were only locked up twice and then only at a range inside 2 miles. Things were no better at higher altitudes, with the radar also failing to track targets at least half the time, thus rendering the ANAB missiles useless. And to add insult to injury, the various avionics weren't adequately shielded from each other, meaning that the navigation system was interfered with by the radar and so on. Yet another radar upgrade was needed, this time to the Typhoon M, which had actually been in development for some years and was ready in February 1971. It was fitted to the original Su-15T prototype, and it was outstandingly unsuccessful. Only 3 of 42 trial missions were completed to specification. With full-scale production now gearing up, the military needed a solution and rushed through further modifications. 123 additional test flights were undertaken towards this goal, which, although they showed some improvement, were still far from perfect. The effort ended when the prototype aircraft decided that it had had enough and elected to self-immolate on the 17th of June 1971. Although not a total loss, it required extensive rebuilding, which would ultimately take nearly a year. Testing ground to a halt until 2 Su-15TMs were built on the factory production line and used to complete the testing. The prototype was eventually returned to service at the end of March, just after testing was finished. Basically, that initial testing program confirmed that even with the Typhoon M, the low-level radar performance was weak. Although the automatic pilot was useful and it reduced crew load, lack of tailplane travel limited its effectiveness and that of the automatic landing approach system. Yet more trials therefore followed. The LNPO Leninitz OKB developed and installed new modules in the radar intended to improve performance in ECM environments and at low level. It was partially effective in that 12 of the 16 low-level intercepts were now successful. The asterisk, as it were, was that the intercepts were performed over flat ground. The first set of 5 intercepts had only resulted in 1 success, and GCI techniques had therefore been altered to help get the interceptor into a more favourable position to use its radar. Later experiences would confirm that the system was largely useless. The ANAB wasn't much better either. The final phase of testing involved live firing of 46 K-98M missiles against a variety of target drones, with sizes ranging from droppable targets through to a Tupolev Tu-16M Badger drone. Some targets were equipped with ECM equipment to increase realism. An excellent 3 of the targets received direct hits, and another 3 were destroyed by a proximity-fused explosion. That is a 13% kill ratio on trigger pull in ideal testing. The first Su-15TMs were received by the PVO in the spring of 1972. Shortly after its introduction, it was discovered that the pointed shape of the nose cone led to internal reflections that led to clutter on the radar screen. A redesigned nose with a more curved profile was introduced in 1973. It cured the radar issue, but at a cost of slightly reduced speed. All SU-15 TMs eventually received the new nose, something that deceived NATO for some time, thinking an entirely new type had entered service. Various smaller upgrade packages were rolled out over time, most notably increasing the precision of the SAU-58 to get the interceptor to the right point. In 1974, successful trials were conducted with the new R-60 aphid dogfight missile. This was carried on the inboard pylons shortly thereafter. A twin launch rail was trialled in the late 1970s to increase magazine depth, but it was never implemented operationally. At the same time, Su-15s began carrying APP-50 chaff and flare dispensers for self-defense. These occupied the under-fuselage pylons, and they thus precluded the carriage of the gun pods. After Belenko's defection in a MiG-25, tests were conducted on an updated version of the Typhoon in which potentially exploitable features were altered. It's unclear whether these were actually ever rolled out to the fleet, as they entailed fairly significant hardware changes. Flagons were produced until February 1982. 1,290 were built, of which about 400 were TMs, 20 were Ts, and the balance were mainly original Su-15s, with some combat-capable two-seat trainers thrown in. The Su-15's first public appearance was at the July 1967 Moscow Air Show. This was the first running of the event for 6 years because of the Khrushchev-era focus on missiles. 5 Su-15s made high-speed passes past the grandstands, giving Western observers ample evidence that the Soviet Union had fielded a new interceptor. They named it Flagon for reasons that are lost to history. By June 1968, 8 fighter regiments were equipped with Flagons, each having around 16 aircraft. Su-15 strength peaked in 1976 at 29 regiments, 18 operating the original version and the balance of 11 flying the Su-15 TM. The first evidence of the Flagon's murderous nature came on the 2nd of April 1976. A Su-15 piloted by one Lieutenant Strizak scrambled from Sokol on Sakhalin Island to intercept a US Air Force RC-135. Shortly after takeoff, he was redirected to intercept a Japanese Lockheed Neptune over the Sea of Japan. He approached it from behind. As he got within 3.5 miles, Strizak apparently flipped the wrong switch and launched an R-98R, which happened to be locked onto the Neptune. Seeing it streak away, the lieutenant regained his composure and turned the Flagon's nose away from the Neptune, causing the missile to lose lock, whiz by the Japanese aircraft's starboard wing, and self-destruct. The next time the Su-15 took on an unarmed opponent, it was much more successful. On the 20th of April 1978, the crew of a Korean Airlines Boeing 707 on a flight from Paris to Anchorage made a major navigational error. They drifted 150 degrees off course and ended up deep in Soviet territory. Its captain, incidentally, had formerly flown MiG-15s against UN forces in the Korean War and apparently had changed sides. Having tracked the aircraft for about 20 minutes, just after 9 o'clock in the evening, the 10th Independent PVO Army ordered a scramble. Captain Alexander Bozov, based at Afrikanda, Murmansk Oblast, Russia, was dispatched to intercept the intruder. Captain Alexander Bozov, based at Afrikanda, was dispatched to intercept the intruder. A second Su-15 TM was also launched from Poduzmeny to assist. On joining up, Bozov assumed that the aircraft was actually an RC-135. He radioed this in. But as he closed with it, he realized that it was an airliner from either Korea, Japan, or China. Remember that he was unlikely to have ever been exposed to these countries or their national airlines, so it's not fair to think he should have known it was a Korean Airlines plane. Nevertheless, he repeatedly informed his controllers that the aircraft was a civilian airliner and described its markings, but his superiors ordered him to shoot it down anyway. He launched 2 aphids from close range at 30,000 feet of altitude. The first somehow missed the giant target in front of it. The second hit the left wing and knocked 4 meters off it. One passenger was killed immediately from shrapnel wounds, and a second died from his injuries before the plane was able to make an emergency landing, an hour and 40 minutes after the missile hit. Interestingly, Bosov made no attempt to follow up his attack. It seems likely that his aircraft was carrying a pair of ANABs, as the aphid was very much a backup weapon for an alert fighter. Anyway, the 707 plunged nearly 30,000 feet after the initial missile hit, which perhaps deceived the Soviet pilot. It's also possible that his radar's lack of look-down capability led to him losing the Boeing in a cloud. As it happens, the other Su-15 fired an R-98MR at a target in the vicinity of the Boeing after it disappeared. This turned out to be falling fragments of the damaged wing. The Flagon's next kill on a defenceless aircraft was 3 years later. In this case, the victim was far from innocent. On the 18th of July 1981, PVO radars near the Iranian border picked up an unidentified aircraft flying at about 26,000 feet into Soviet airspace. A pair of Su-15s were scrambled, but the contact faded out. 2 hours later, however, another unidentified aircraft was detected. This time, a single Su-15 flown by Captain Valentin Kulyapin was scrambled, armed with 2 R-98s and 2 R-60s. The intruder turned out to be a Canadair CL-44, chartered from an Argentine company and being used to smuggle weapons from Israel to Iran. Kulyapin flew alongside and indicated that the freighter should follow him using hand signals. Its pilot proceeded to turn into the interceptor in an attempt to force it away as it headed for the border. Fearing that it would escape, GCI ordered Kulyapin to shoot the freighter down. Deciding that it would take too long to drop back and engage with a missile, he elected to ram the big turboprop. And no, I have no idea why dropping back a mile to shoot an aphid would take too long. In fairness, Kulyapin had obviously been thinking about this eventuality for a while. He moved into line astern, pitched up into a climb, and neatly sliced off the CL-44's starboard tailplane with his wing and fuselage. The freighter pitched over and plummeted to the ground, killing all 4 crew members. Unfortunately, the Su-15 also sustained serious damage. Kulyapin ejected safely and parachuted down amidst the wreckage of both aircraft. For his services, he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. We now come to the incident that defined the Su-15. On the night of the 1st of September 1983, another Korean Airlines flight, this time a 747, was travelling from New York to Seoul via Anchorage. In order to do so, it needed to travel in a narrow air route that passed close to Soviet airspace. Worse still, that airspace passed over some of the most sensitive sites in the Soviet Union. Flight 007 made a navigational error and started to fly over this area. A MiG-23P was immediately scrambled and made contact with the intruder, but, in a stroke of genius, it had not been fully fueled to prevent pilot defections, and therefore it had to return to base. Having been in restricted airspace for 2.5 hours, the 747 left it for a while, but was headed now for Sakhalin Island. By this point, the PVO were in a panic. Having a large, unidentified but evidently enemy aircraft fly around with impunity didn't look great. Shooting it down, therefore, became a priority. 2 Su-15s were launched from Sokol, armed with a pair of R-98s and their gun pods. The lead aircraft, piloted by Major Gennady Osipovich, was unable to identify the passenger plane as a 747 as it cruised along at 36,000 feet. On 4 occasions, he fired warning shots across the aircraft's nose, but the cannons were loaded with armor-piercing rather than tracers and passed unnoticed. At this stage, he had fired 243 rounds at what he believed to be a military aircraft. Blissfully unaware of the danger, the 747 crew asked for and received permission to ascend to 38,000 feet in order to improve fuel economy. This led to the aircraft's speed falling from 400 knots to 215, approaching the Su-15's stall speed. Osipovich and the GCI took this as an attempt to escape. As he broke hard and attempted to evade, he was therefore ordered to shoot down the aircraft before it crossed back into international waters. Interviewed a decade later, Osipovich expressed his resulting dilemma in technical rather than in human terms. He had expended half of his ammunition, and the Flagon's poor gun sight made success less than likely with only 250 rounds. The big aircraft might be able to escape with damage. Other pilots might have been tempted to ram, but Osipovich considered that in poor taste. Ramming was a last resort. Killing 269 civilians is just fine, however, so the Soviet pilot dove below the Boeing, then pulled up into a steep climb in afterburner. He got a lock and he launched both R-98s. The first missile was radar guided and detonated 160 feet behind the 747. Multiple control cables were severed in the tail and the aircraft began to pitch up. The second missile was infrared guided and homed on the left wing. Although it probably detonated, Osipovich's contention that it knocked off half of the wing doesn't fit with the evidence later collected by accident investigators. Damage from the second missile appears to have been nominal and certainly non-critical. The tail damage was, sadly, terminal, leading to Flight 007 departing controlled flight. The aircraft came down in international waters in the Sea of Japan, having been almost certainly engaged in international airspace. Although far from the only accidental airliner shoot-down in the Cold War, it came at a period of uniquely high tensions and was exploited by the Reagan administration to ratchet up pressure and drop-off. Although best known for atrocities, when it wasn't massacring civilians, the Su-15 and its pilots found time for fun. In this case, that fun was intercepting and shooting at the high-altitude balloons that the US sent over the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s. These proved hard targets, but their metal and thus radar-reflecting recon gear could now and again be locked up and engaged with R-98s. Due to the cost and complexity of the MiG-25P, the Su-15 ended up being the PVO's primary interceptor in the 1970s and much of the 1980s. It was therefore an important adversary that NATO needed to defeat. And it wasn't just a threat to SAC. Su-15s also guarded sites and access routes on the Soviet Union's southern border, and as demonstrated with Flight 007, the northeastern coastline too. In an all-out war, it would have been encountered by tactical fighters as well as bombers. Although it could, and regularly did, carry R-60 aphids and gun pods, the Su-15 wasn't up to much as a conventional air superiority fighter. Although it had a better thrust-to-weight ratio than the F-4 Phantom, its structure was insufficiently strong to engage in high-G pull-ups and thus use the vertical plane in an engagement with the US fighter. Its engines were also slow to respond to the throttle, an issue shared with the MiG-21. Unsurprisingly, its wing loading was higher at 92 pounds per square foot versus about 78 on the F-4E. As I've already said, it was a poor air-to-air gunnery platform because of the lack of an effective sight. Not that the F-4 was a world beater in this regard either, but at least its designers had the right idea. NATO's second-tier fighter bombers like the F-100 didn't have the speed to outrun the Flagon at altitude, but they were fast enough down on the deck. This, coupled with the Typhoon radar's lack of look-down capability, meant that multiple border incursions by Turkish F-100s went unpunished, as the Flagons couldn't get a lock on. The Soviets did have the last laugh, however. In 1976, they set up a SAM trap and shot down a Super Sabre that had evaded the interceptors by flying low. Lack of ability against low-flying tactical fighters would have been an issue in war, as the Turkish F-100s and F-104s were nuclear-capable, and would have likely been able to avoid SAMs by flying singly and arriving at targets from multiple directions. The Su-15 was intended to fill those gaps, alongside point defense types like the MiG-21PF and the MiG-23. For SAC commanders, the Flagon was fast in comparison to the B-52 at altitude, and it did have some speed advantages on the deck, although the look-down issue remained. PVO doctrine appears to have been for Flagons to be used singly, armed with gun pods and 2 R-98s. Standard US interceptor doctrine was, of course, for a pair of aircraft per flight, but then they were faced with fewer bombers. The Flagon was essentially to be used as a kind of mobile SAM site, with GCI issuing navigational commands that the pilot either followed by aligning the intended guidance course with the crosshairs on his in-cockpit equipment, or potentially even surrendering control of the interceptor to the autopilot for the initial approach to the target. The engagement itself was flown by the pilot. Radio traffic during the intercepts I mentioned earlier suggests that the exact weapons and tactics that the pilot used in the final moments was largely up to them, with similarly armed pilots using aphids, ANABs, and ramming in ostensibly similar engagements. Lack of range meant that the pilots were briefed for a one-way trip in wartime. The PVO also maintained numerous secondary airfields that could be used to divert to as an alternative option to ejecting. Those bases lacked instrument landing beacons, and I doubt they had many, if any, facilities for rearming the jets. Some tests were done with strengthened landing gear for the Su-15 that would enable it to have the same rough field capabilities as the MiG-23, but they never saw service. Fundamentally, the Flagon was a bit of a funny creature. Although large, it didn't have extraordinary range. Combat radius was just 450 miles. For comparison, the F-106 was both faster and it had 10% more range in a combat situation. In ferry configuration, the Delta Dart had more than double the range of the Flagon, and from 1967 it could refuel in flight, something that the Su-15 could never do. The Flagon also lacked really exceptional performance. Even clean, it would only just break Mach 2, and of course it lacked the absolute cutting edge of Soviet-era electronics, both in terms of its radar, its computers, and its weapons. As a nice, stable platform for all-weather intercepts in peacetime, it was just great. When civilians needed killing, it was always ready and able. But in wartime, its avionics limitations were demonstrably an issue. The evidence from actions around the Turkish border was that its usefulness against tactical-type aircraft was very low. And in multiple interceptions of bomber-sized aircraft, Flagon pilots lost track of their targets when they made quite benign maneuvers. It's hard to imagine it being particularly effective in wartime when confronted by B-52s, FB-111s, and later B-1s, all of which would fly on the nap of the Earth and make extensive use of ECM. SR-71s and probably also B-58s were too fast at altitude and were able to stay out of the Flagon's quite small weapons radius. You can therefore see why the Su-27 and the MiG-31 were such priorities for the Soviet military in the middle to late 1970s. Although neither was massively faster than the Flagon, they had sufficient radar sophistication and the improved missiles required to actually defend Soviet airspace. Various upgrade plans were proposed and even tested. Engine options were explored starting in the middle 1960s and going as far as a version of the future MiG-29 unit. The Su-15 bis actually flew with a 15,500-pound Force R-25-300. A prototype also flew with what basically amounted to an entire MiG-25 avionics system in it, including a Smerch radar. That was deemed pointless, as the upside of the Flagon was that it was cheap to buy and operate compared to the Foxbat. Later, the MiG-23's Sapphire-23 and R-23 Apex missile combination was explored. All of these were dismissed as the Su-15 platform, which it has to be remembered was strongly based on the 1950s Su-9, was now decrepit. Expending resources on it wasn't worthwhile in the more economically constrained times that the Soviet Union was experiencing. Even so, most Su-15s remained in the inventory all the way up to the end of communism. Some of them were transferred to tactical aviation as Su-27s became available for use over German battlefields. When the Soviet Union collapsed, though, they were rapidly retired, with the last Russian example mothballed in 1994. Ukraine was the type's final operator, bringing the Flagon's 30-year career and its killing spree to a close in 1996.